Today is July 2nd, 2018, and we are pretty far out from the 2020 election, but today we're going to go through an election prediction between the most popular senator in the United States, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, probably the front runner right now for the 2020 Democratic nomination, and of course the incumbent president, Donald Trump. So we're not going to do this based off leaning and likely ratings. We're going to purely go through each state and how they would end up in 2020 if the election was held today. So Bernie Sanders is one of the top names for the Democratic nomination, so really there's not much to push away from him. You can't take away the fact that progressives are making a much bigger implication on the Democratic Party now than they did back in 2016, and with a whole new wave of progressives coming into Congress. Everything with things like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or in my home state of Maryland, with Ben Jealous winning the governor Democratic nomination for the general election. That's something that's going to be mentioned by progressives a lot, and Bernie Sanders is one of those progressives. He's someone who, Hillary Clinton had claimed to be a progressive when she needed a number of those states, like up in the Northeast and a part of the Midwest, but the message didn't really resonate, that she didn't do that well in the primary. Then she went back to portraying herself as a moderate and led into the general election under that image. Bernie Sanders would probably be one of the few Democratic nominees who would ever actually proclaim themselves a progressive, or, at times people may say he's a socialist, but really he's a progressive, a self-proclaimed progressive. But when we're going through this map, we're going to do the poll closing method. So essentially, we're going to start off with Indiana, Kentucky, South Carolina, the 7 p.m. poll closings, and finish off at Alaska at 1 a.m. So we're going to start off with the states of Indiana, Kentucky, and South Carolina. Keep in mind these states are probably going to be pretty safe for the president. Indiana could get a little bit closer than previous election years, but we're not going to see it flip in an election like this. In Georgia, I also see that one going to Donald Trump very narrowly, but for the sake of the beginning of the video, we'll just leave that one as a toss-up and come back to it. You already know how I'm going to make the indication. But Virginia and Vermont easily go to Bernie Sanders. Typical Democratic state, not much is going to change that. West Virginia goes to Trump. Ohio, North Carolina, toss-up states. And then we move over to 8 p.m. Pretty solid in almost all the states for either political party, because of the fact that these states are, this is probably the most partisan poll closing except for 11 p.m. So Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania, I can actually be comfortable enough to call that one outright for Bernie Sanders, along with New Hampshire and all of Maine. And Bernie Sanders, message on the economy and being able to appeal much better than Hillary Clinton was to the white working class, that's something that's enough to put him over the top. Bernie Sanders, not only does he have the Northeastern appeal, so he carries states like Maine, New Hampshire, but Pennsylvania is a state that narrowly went to Donald Trump by around 44,000 votes in 2016. That was less than, I believe, 2% of the entire state of Pennsylvania. So if Bernie Sanders is able to even narrowly improve amongst white working class voters, it lands in the Democratic column. Keep in mind, these states are still Democratic states. They just have one time gone for a Republican, just like Indiana did for the Democrats back in 2008. But if Republicans can't hold on to these type of voters, they're not going to carry it in 2020, especially not against such a strong candidate like Bernie Sanders. But Florida, again, toss-up state. 8:30 rolls around, Arkansas goes to Trump, and then 9 p.m. we go up across the United States. In Nebraska, second, I'm comfortable enough calling that one for Bernie Sanders right now. Bernie Sanders has an amazing Midwestern appeal. It's something that isn't comparable to almost any Democrat. You'd have to take top figures like Joe Biden to even compare the appeal to the Midwest, because Bernie Sanders was able to do phenomenal here in the Democratic primary and in the general. He's gone to states like West Virginia and convinced a number of those voters to back away from Trump and possibly support him. I'm not saying he's going to win in West Virginia. I've already characterized that one as safe for Donald Trump. But again, it just goes to show how his resonation with people and being able to appeal to these people in the Midwest and across the country definitely is going to help him. They see him as a realist, someone who's going to talk to them and tell them the truth, and that's basically the message that definitely would help in swing districts like this. Going across the Rust Belt, pretty solid for Bernie Sanders. Again, with Pennsylvania going, the rest of the Rust Belt is going as well. All three of the Rust Belt states did not have as many votes for Trump as Pennsylvania. New York goes to Bernie Sanders, obviously. It's a state of New York, and that puts Bernie Sanders at 196 electoral votes and Donald Trump at 147. 10 p.m. rolls around, Iowa becomes a toss-up, Utah goes for Trump, Montana goes for Trump, and Nevada becomes a toss-up state. And now we're going to essentially announce history. Bernie Sanders wins the presidency of the United States at 274 electoral votes at the 11 p.m. call, and then Alaska goes to Trump, giving him 3 electoral votes. So this finishes off the map with around 7 swing states: Nevada, Arizona, Iowa, Ohio, North Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. I started off with Georgia in the beginning of the video. Georgia would probably still go to President Trump. He would probably do pretty well here, considering the fact that Georgia is still a Republican state. Speaking of Republican states, Arizona, I also see narrowly going to the president. I understand Bernie Sanders would do phenomenal with minorities, just as every Democrat would, but I think he would be able to expand on them a little bit more, gaining a little bit more of the progressive vote. But keep in mind, these states are still Republican at heart and still hold Republican identity, and it's going to take a lot for Democrats to win in these states. I'm not saying it's impossible, but right now I still see a narrow Trump victory. But in Nevada, that one's not really a toss-up. It's usually a toss-up, so history tells us that one's going blue. Florida, I see going to Bernie Sanders. Now, with all the push, Florida's becoming a more Democratic state in general. A whole new wave of voters, a whole new type of voter that's coming out of the state of Florida is going to become an increasingly more Democratic state, and we see Florida pushing towards the agenda of a Bernie Sanders type presidency. I understand Hillary Clinton overwhelmingly won here in the 2016 Democratic primaries, but Clinton supporters wouldn't really veer off into a third-party candidate, whereas Bernie Sanders supporters could, because they had a candidate who better, I guess, represented them than Hillary Clinton, whereas Hillary Clinton Democrats really can only stay with the Democratic Party. Many of them threatened to leave back in 2008, and barely any of them did. And in 2016, they did win the nomination, so that wasn't really a discussion. But again, these type of Democrats would stick with their nominee, whereas the other ones weren't really Democrats because they were Democrats turn, independent type Democrats, the Bernie Sanders type Democrat, the progressive type, who would back candidates that only supported them, and that's great for them, but it wasn't really beneficial to the Democratic Party. But again, it was all about getting their voices heard. They're not going to be forced to vote for a candidate just because it's under that nomination. They can vote for whoever they want to, and you really shouldn't hold people to how they vote unless it's detrimental to your values. So enough talking about that. We're going to finish off this map. So 39 electoral votes right now. Donald Trump would probably narrowly carry North Carolina. Obama couldn't do it in 2012. He won it by 14,000 votes in 2008. Not much for the Democrats in North Carolina, especially since they probably won't be targeting it here, considering that Bernie Sanders probably wouldn't appeal best to North Carolina type voters. And then we finish off the map. Ohio goes to Bernie Sanders. I don't see a possibility of Donald Trump winning here, only because Bernie Sanders does an amazing job at resonating with a number of these white working class voters. Ohio, with extended African American turnout, opposition to the president, progressive voters, and white working class voters coming back to Bernie Sanders, everything is just right for him. And speaking of the Midwestern appeal, Iowa goes to Bernie Sanders as well, finishing off the map with 333 electoral votes for Bernie Sanders and 205 for President Trump. So this map looks very similar to what we saw back in the 2012 election, except for the fact that Nebraska's 2nd district is flipped. So really, this has all come down to Bernie Sanders being that progressive, the one who can actually do the best job at governing the people just based off how people perceive him. This puts him at an advantage over a number of other Democrats, and he would go on to win the general election if it was held today. Again, I can't predict the future. I cannot predict what's going to happen with things with the economy, issues, events that occur. But right now, Bernie Sanders would win 333 to Donald Trump's 205. Thank you guys for watching this video. Comment down suggestions below, and I'll see you all tomorrow.